Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Forest Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, Primate Pursuits, the primatologist's journey through fieldwork and life. And to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube live from Forest Space. We are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Teichroeb, Montreal. Here at Forest Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities that examine research questions, projects, things in development across the university. We're running today's event as a live stream Zoom meeting. So for those of you joining us on Zoom, we welcome any comments or questions in the chat. And for those of you here in the space, if you'd like to participate, just let us know by raising your hand and we'll bring a microphone over to you. Okay, with that, it's very much my pleasure to hand things over to PhD candidate, environmental science, and 2003-24 Public Scholar Brogan Stewart. Brogan, it's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you to the Forest Space. Thanks everyone for coming in person. This is such a great turnout, and thanks to everyone who's online as well. So just for a bit of background, when I started my PhD, I went to a primatology conference, and it was an international one. So there was primatologists from all over the world that came. And before I went, I was like, oh, this is probably just gonna be like super academic and boring. And I hate that I thought that, but I didn't know what to expect. So once I got to this conference, I loved it. I absolutely loved hearing about everyone's research. It was so fascinating hearing about all the different species, how intelligent primates are, oh, their social interactions. I just loved it. But then not just hearing about the research, but talking with everyone around drinking coffee, during lunch, afterwards. It was so interesting hearing things about fieldwork, about the individual animals themselves, and kind of the back end stuff as well. So the reason I wanted to have this panel and this event today is I wanted to bring a little snapshot of these primatology conferences to Concordia today. And so we have 4 panelists today. The way that this event is going to be structured is first, each panelist is going to get a chance to talk about themselves and their research. So first, we'll have Dr. Julie Teichroeb from the University of Toronto. Then we'll have Dr. Iulia Bădescu from Université de Montréal. Then we'll have Dr. Laura Bolt from the University of Toronto. And then Dr. Sarah Turner, who is my supervisor from Concordia. She'll present, and I'll talk a bit about my research after that as well. So after that, we're going to sit down and have a discussion where I'll ask the panelists some questions. Then after that, we're going to open it up to the audience and to the Zoom, and you'll be able to ask your questions then. So if you think of a question while they're presenting, jot it down or take a mental note and then keep it till the end. Okay, great. So we'll start with Dr. Julie Teichroeb.
I'm good. Can you guys, everyone can hear me? Perfect. All right. So thank you so much for being here, and thank you to Brogan for the invite. So I am a primatologist at the University of Toronto. So I'm going to give you kind of an overview of my career, which is already, 25 years old or more. I'll start, I guess, as we all do. When I was younger, I loved animals my whole life. I really wanted to study animal behavior, but I didn't think that anyone actually did that for a job. And I thought, okay, well, people that like animals are vets, right? So I volunteered at a vet clinic in my senior year of high school. And I was like, oh, I hate this a lot, actually. I was like, so maybe I'm a zoologist, actually. So I went to the University of Calgary. Let's see. And I registered in zoology, and a lot of the courses were very much about invertebrate taxonomy, nothing but worm taxonomy for a long time. And I was feeling quite despondent, thinking, well, nobody does what I do. I know Jane Goodall does what I do, or what I want to do, right? So, what should I do? I was really actually, looking through the calendar, sort of depressed, and I found this field called anthropology, which I didn't know existed. And there's all these courses, primate ecology, primate behavior, I was like, oh, well, what's this? I should maybe take a course. So my first course was with Mary Pavelka at the University of Calgary, who is an incredibly dynamic lecturer. And I'm not kidding, the first lecture, I was like, ding, 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 like, oh my God, like this exists, people do this. This is the most amazing thing ever. I started to take every course that there was in the anthropology department. I switched to anthropology, my grades skyrocketed, which is great. And I started to work under Jim Patterson for several independent studies. He studied baboons in Uganda, but I worked on independent studies with him at the zoo and things like that. And then I started my master's with Jim Patterson at the University of Calgary, and we had just hired Pascale Sacotte, who you might recognize. She is now the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Concordia. And Pascale had formerly studied mountain gorillas and was starting a new field site in Ghana, studying ursine black and white colobus, or Colobus velarosus. So I went with her first PhD student, and we started the field site there, habituated the monkeys, mapped and measured all the trees. And it was such a rewarding experience that I continued to my PhD in Calgary with Pascale. And we at that time hired Linda Fettigan at the University of Calgary, who is world famous primatologist and was a really important mentor to me at this time. And I had a pretty amazing graduate school experience. So as I said, I worked in Ghana. So it's located, in West Africa, right where it's pointing there, on Colobus velarosus. And because I did both my master's and my PhD there, I spent actually 2.5 years in Ghana over a 10-year period. I also taught a bunch of field schools there after my fieldwork. And it was, a life-changing experience, truly, to live with these people and to get to know everyone in the village and follow these monkeys. So for Colobus velarosus, there was almost nothing known. There had been a really brief natural history study once in the south of Ghana. And so everything we found out was new and exciting. So for my master's, I focused really on basic natural history. What is their diet? What is their ranging behavior? And then once I got to know them really well, I focused my PhD on looking at kind of the interplay between what determined their social organization. So how many males, how many females are in a group. So I looked at whether it was just food competition, which was constraining their group size, or we had actually sadly seen quite a few infanticides in this population where new males come into a group and in an effort to sire offspring, kill the offspring that were previously there. And I thought, well, this must be a pretty major evolutionary pressure for them. So I wanted to contrast for my PhD, the food competition pressures that might determine social organization versus the infanticide pressures. And yeah, everything went amazing I did, I think, 22 months of fieldwork for my PhD. And here is a brief snapshot of the stuff that we learned. But honestly, this project is still going to this day. It's almost 25 years old. And we've done amazing research there. So some of the first things we found out is all males disperse from the natal group, so at sexual maturity, but only some females disperse, and some females decide to stay in their natal group if the situation is good. Some females, decide to leave and seek out a better territory, a better male. However, when groups get too large, there is actually a big increase in food competition. And so there's the forced eviction in large groups of young females by older females who don't want to lose kind of their position, in terms of their ability to get food. So we did find evidence for within group scramble competition for food, especially at larger group sizes when there's more mouths to feed and everyone has to search for food and range further. But we also found a lot of between group contest competition for food. So direct, fighting to control the territories. But this fighting is mostly done by males. So males are kind of hired guns to kind of try to defend, food resources for females, and females, kind of choose the best male. Very often they would try to transfer into groups that had the strongest males that were winning a lot. But we found over the years in studying these monkeys in this fragment where they're quite well protected and they're also locally sacred. And so, it's the one place in Ghana where the monkeys aren't hunted really extensively for food. And so the population density has increased in this fragment over time. And now we found that female participation in between group contests has been increasing over time because males are sort of at their limit in terms of how much they can fight. You can't go from 100% higher, basically. So as I said, infanticide by males occurs pretty frequently in this population. But there's a lot of counter strategies that mothers have that, the males who think they sired the offspring will really aggressively defend what they think are their offspring. So lots of different counter strategies and some really fascinating ways that infanticide risk has actually shaped the evolution of this species. So just, a truly fascinating deep dive into, the natural history of a species that no one really knew about. It was such an exciting opportunity. So I finished my PhD in 2009. I was super jazzed, the future is so bright and all that. And then there was the economic turndown of 2009. So these are online job postings in the US, but you can see the 2009 line, wah, wah. So there were no jobs and, it was a major mortgage crisis in the US and things like this. So a little bit of a rough time actually to finish my PhD. And my mentors in Calgary were super supportive. The first year they provided me with, some contract teaching in Calgary to keep me afloat. While I desperately tried to apply for funding, which had totally dried up really and had become incredibly competitive, or any postdoc positions, which were basically non-existent. So I was getting a bit desperate after the first year after my PhD. And at many different conferences, I'd hung out with this guy, Colin Chapman at McGill University, and he'd said, you should do a postdoc with me. You should do a postdoc with me. And at this point, I was, I'm going to call Colin's bluff. I'm calling him up and I'm going to say, hey, can I do a postdoc with you? And he, luckily for me, he did have some money, only for 1 year, but it kept me going to the field. So I went to this new site he was starting at Lake Nabagabo in southern Uganda. So he was just habituating vervet monkeys there. And so I helped him habituate them, get them ID'd and named. And I started to do some little navigation experiments on them because they were, stealing people's food, crop raiding, going into people's houses, trashing everything. They're just like bad little smart monkeys. And so I thought, let's give them something to occupy their time. So I started to do some cognition experiments on them, which proved to be really, really rewarding. So after my year with Colin, there was still no good jobs. So I did a 1 year, it was called a visiting assistant professorship, but it's basically a teaching postdoc where they provide you with no support, So I taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz for a year. Then I got a similar type of position at Duke University, so a visiting assistant professor, but luckily this was for 3 years. So my husband and I, who'd been separated during my postdoc years, he came to North Carolina. We had our first baby in North Carolina. And the cool thing about Duke is that it's got a really big, diverse evolutionary anthropology department, lots of people that study lots of things, including lots of primates. Also, there is the Duke Lemur Center. And so I was able to work at the Duke Lemur Center and do some of these navigation kind of experiments I'd been doing on vervet monkeys with the lemurs. And I have a slight kind of obsession with eyes. I don't know if you guys know what eyes are, but they're basically the coolest animal that's ever existed on the face of the earth. No joke. So this is eyes, and they had some at the Lemur Center. And so I thought, oh, I'll do, nobody knows anything about how nocturnal primates navigate. So I'll do some comparative experiments, and I'll do on the gray mouse lemurs, the fat-tailed dwarf lemurs, and the eyes. And I set up some little navigation arrays for them at the Lemur Center and looked at how they actually solved the exact same problem I had posed to the vervets. One of the problems I'd posed to the vervets in the field, but just kind of shrunk down to the scale of captivity. So that ended up being like an amazing experience. So even though I was still sort of precariously employed and postdocing, I found, I was really expanding my network in terms of all the colleagues I was meeting and working with, but also all the cool things I was able to do. And thank goodness, after 2 years at Duke, the pot at the end of the rainbow, University of Toronto, finally started hiring again. And I got hired there as an assistant professor in 2015. So since then, I've been really lucky. So my whole postdoc time after work with Colin, I still went to Nabagabo every summer, and I still continued my work at Nabagabo, on little tiny pots of money that I could find. So I was really well set up to start as a professor. I had a field site I already kind of established, which was really great place to send my students. And we are still continuing to do the field experiments on the vervets at Nabagabo, but we had actually discovered that there is some colobus living in the fragments around Nabagabo, these forest fragments, some black and white colobus, and my true love is columbine monkeys. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about them at the end because they've really proven to be amazing. So anyway, since then I've been working at Nabagabo, sending my students usually a set every year, but also going back myself. And it's been, an incredibly supportive community in which to work in. And with the vervet monkeys, we've continued to do all sorts of different experiments that we can set up, experimental arrays and puzzle boxes and things to try to get at how they make decisions, what they value, what's the extent of their cognition. And that has been incredibly rewarding. So just a snapshot again of things we found out over the last 12 years. Well, when they actually look for food, they don't rely on, not surprising, they're a primate, a cercopithecine primate. They don't rely on scent or even like spatial location so much. They really rely on vision very heavily. When they navigate through our arrays, they use really simple kind of heuristic rules, the same way that we navigate. So, trying to find your way through multiple different targets is incredibly difficult. This is this complex mathematical problem called the traveling salesman problem. And so like us, they don't, sit there and calculate every angle and every, the distance between sites. They just use a very simple heuristic rule, like you use when you go to the grocery store, right? Go to the closest resource that has yet to be visited, the nearest neighbor rule, or go in a circle. So these guys do the same thing, but our experiments have shown that they can actually plan their routes. They're smart enough to plan their routes. It's just that they prefer not to, right? Because it's a lot of cognitive effort. So just like us, they're lazy. They prefer, really good quality food, even if it's of lower quantity than sort of a larger quantity food. But they make different decisions. So in our arrays, it's really cool because sometimes they'll come alone and they'll answer, the question that we've set up for them alone. But sometimes they come in competition with the rest of the group, and they do different things when they're in competition than when they're alone, which is really very interesting to us. So they make different decisions in competition and they favor different things. And a lot of it's just to avoid competition. And we found especially that subordinates are incredibly, they're paying attention to an incredible number of variables when they make decisions in these arrays. So they're looking at where dominants are, how close dominants are, how fast dominants could actually travel to displace them. And if they're trying to get food out of some sort of puzzle box, they actually take into account their own skill in removing the food in terms of how many other resources they're going to try to go to. So subordinates are paying attention to an incredible amount of things just to avoid aggression and max out their food intake. And our more recent stuff has shown that subordinates actually learn more quickly as well. So they pay attention to social cues and how other individuals are solving these puzzle boxes, and dominants don't really care. Dominants, they're like, whatever, I control this thing, but then it's taking forever and they're, just trashing it and not solving it well. And we've recently done some mathematical work with these engineers at the University of Toronto and shown that actually subordinates actually have quite a different discounting factor than dominants, meaning they discount the future much more heavily. They don't rely that they'll ever be able to get things in the future, and they make decisions quite differently based on this discount factor. Whereas dominants have a very high rate of a very high discount factor, so they're kind of assured that they're going to get things. So this is kind of an overview of some of our vervet work. But as I said, so there's these colobus that were at Nabagabo in the tall forest behind the research site. I assumed that they were Colobus gareza, which is the black and white colobus species that's through most of Eastern Africa. But in fact, they turned out to be these Ruwenzori Angolan colobus, this rare subspecies of Angolan colobus that occurs in the mountains of Uganda and Rwanda. And basically in Rwanda, it had been known for a while that this colobus was a really weird outlier. So basically they formed these huge conglomerations of like 500 monkeys moving all together. And it was, this very confusing thing that people were just calling super troops, these super troops of colobus that nobody knows. And it's sort of suspected that they were forming a multi-level society, which is one of the most complex forms of social organization shown in primates. So I was very jazzed when we actually, looked at the colobus at Nabagabo and realized they were Ruwenzori Angolan colobus. And because they're up in the trees here and the band, the confusing mass of monkeys is only about 150 and not 500, we started to really work at just trying to ID them individually and get to know them, and so that we could really start to understand their social organization. And it turns out they are forming a multi-level society, but it's different from any other multi-level society found in the primates so far. So basically in most multi-level societies in primates, so this is where the groups, the core units, cluster into successive levels or tiers. The Ruwenzori-Colobus multi-level society. So first, let me explain what they normally look like in primates. There's only a few primates that form these, and it's always these one male units, these OMUs. So one male, multi-female core units clustering into tiers. And then there'll be a big group of unmated bachelor males that are always attacking these one male units, trying to get access to females. We call the bachelor band or the all male unit. So it turned out in Ruwenzori and Colobus, we have almost never, we've had 2 all male units very briefly in the now 7 years of data that we have on this species. And instead we have one male units clustering with multi-male units. So these multi-male units often have even 8, 9, 10 males. And males are really quite tightly bonded to each other and kind of stay together throughout life. So a much different kind of system than is seen in other primate multi-level societies, and turning out to be a really, really, like, I think the rest of my career will be trying to figure out these crazy monkeys actually, which is pretty fun. So some things we've learned so far. So males actually disperse within our study band. So we have core units that cluster into clans, that cluster into a big band where we've ID'd everybody. And then bands hang out with other bands too. So we think it's a 4-tiered multi-level society. Males are dispersing within the band, so staying closer, than females who often disperse between bands. So this is kind of the opposite dispersal pattern of the other black and white colobus too, in that usually females disperse less and much more closely than males who disperse further. Here we have males staying closer, you know, with kin, females dispersing between bands. Most grooming in proximity is actually an opposite sex dyad, so males grooming with females, which again is the opposite of all the other black and white colobus, which are female-female grooming in proximity. So it's starting to explain why this species is such a wild outlier in its clade. Males are really tolerant of one another. As I said, some dyads are really bonded. They've stayed together over the entire study. We've had some dyads of males that have been together, transferring together. You know, there's this real like camaraderie between the males. And this is kind of what's allowing the formation of these multi-male units and allowing all this close clustering of units. Whereas in Colobus velarosus, you know, the males would aggressively fight and like rip each other apart if the groups got too close to each other. Here we have all of this clustering of units and males being really close. Infanticide appears rare. We have yet to see one, but we do think it does probably occur. And males actually often carry infants, which again is not seen in other black and white colobus, and they display with them at other units and they pass them between each other. Like one male will pick up a baby, display with it, pass it to another male who displays with it, and then they hug each other. Oh, good job, good infant care. It's very interesting, and we're trying to figure out what's going on with this crazy species. We've also noted that the inter-unit dominance hierarchy is present. So some units outrank other units. And actually one of our study clans outranks the entire other study clan. So it's just a few things that we found out, but really, really cool species. And I'm very, very glad that I started working with them. So that's it for me. I thank you for listening, and I'm excited to hear your questions later.
Just keep it moving. Thank you. Hi, my name is Iulia, and I'm excited to talk to you today about who I am. I'll start off with who I am professionally. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about my childhood, just because Julie did. So I think that's maybe interesting. But yeah, I'm an immigrant. I came to Canada when I was 9. And moved around a little bit, but ended up in Calgary, which, as Julie mentioned, is a hotspot of primatologists in Canada. And around the age of 11, I think I did a project on mountain gorillas randomly and found sort of Diane Fossey and instantly became very enamored. And I found it so romantic, the idea of kind of going to the forest and living alone and, you know, just being by myself with a bunch of apes. So that was really what got me interested in primatology. And luckily, when I went to do my bachelor's at the University of Calgary, without really knowing it, it was like the hotspot of primatology. So, I just very quickly found my people there and did a bachelor's and in primatology. They had a program in like a bachelor's in science in primatology at the time. And then I went on to do my master's at the University of Calgary as well with Pascal Sicotte, who you'll see in a little a photo, and who's now at Concordia. And then I went to the University of Toronto, where I did my PhD with an anthropologist or also cross-appointed to public health, to nutrition, so like a human biologist. Daniel Sullen is his name. And he was looking for a primatology student to answer some big evolutionary questions about the evolution of infant care, infant feeding, and lactation. And that was very much up my alley. So this is why I very much call myself an anthropologist, because I know a lot of primatologists don't necessarily consider themselves anthropologists. Like a lot of primatologists are even in different departments and have different backgrounds. But I personally very much identify with the concept of anthropology because the field of anthropology, because I'm very much interested in understanding human behavior. So what the actual point of interest for me is very much humans. I wouldn't say they're the coolest primate. I agree with Julie that I think colobines are the best primate, and because they get a bad rap. And they're actually so cool, as Julie pointed out. Yeah, so I see myself as an anthropologist. I'm very interested in doing comparative work between, as you'll see, I study chimpanzees, so between chimpanzees and humans, and trying to understand or trying to create narratives around the evolution of hominins and of our own species. Now I am an associate professor agrégé dans le département d'anthropologie à l'Université de Montréal. I was hired there, luckily, before I even finished my PhD, which is very rare. So I was very, very lucky to get a job before I finished my PhD. Then I could defend and start a job right away. I didn't do any postdocs. And now I'm at the University of Montreal, a Francophone university. I've followed the program, the francisation, and I speak French now, not that well, but enough to teach students and supervise and work with colleagues. So my study species, like I said, for my PhD, I studied chimpanzees. This is the Eastern chimpanzee subspecies. And I focus on mothers and infants. I'll talk quite a bit about that, but that's my main study species. So for my PhD, I went to Ngogo, Uganda, in Kibale National Park, Uganda, which I would describe as kind of the ideal fieldwork situation. It's so beautiful, very, a lot of roughing it kind of thing. Like, we pee and poop in a hole in the ground. There's no toilet. We sleep in tents. We have a little chimp house here where we, do our work and stuff. This is where we shower. This is where we all sit and have dinner and talk about the chimps. Because when we're there, all we do, like all primatologists, you kind of just talk about the primates you've been observing all day and gossip about, because it's like a soap opera in the forest. Gossip about who was mean to whom and who's who's in estrus, and the males are harassing the females, and which males we like, which we don't like. We all have chimpanzee boyfriends. Mine was Rasan, but he died, unfortunately, because it's tough being a primate. And it's great. There's a lot of chimps. It's the largest chimpanzee community being studied with over 200 individuals. There's even a chimp right here, right above my tent. And this is when the chimps came into camp one day. So we took the opportunity to take some nice photos. That's me. Usually the conditions to observe chimps are not so good. So this is actually pretty ideal. And you use binoculars to observe the chimps up high in the trees. The forest looks like this. And the chimps at Ngogo are featured in this Netflix series, if you'd like to see about their intra-community split that they have, where our chimpanzee community has now fissioned into two separate communities, and they're like killing each other, and there's all these internal politics. And it's very interesting. I was there when a lot of that started happening in 2018. So I've done like a few different field seasons at Ngogo, and yeah, it's a wonderful site. This is my second study species. You've heard a lot about the colobus from Julie, but and you can actually see Julie right here. And there is Pascal as well, and there's me. So this was during a field school. So I did a field school before I started my master's through the University of Calgary at Boabeng Female Monkey Sanctuary in Ghana. Julie was my instructor, a wonderful instructor, and Pascal then ended up being my master's supervisor. And I also did my master's at Boabeng Female Monkey Sanctuary on infant, on alloparental care, so care by individuals other than the mother. I looked at like kinship relationships and if that influenced alloparental care. I saw some infanticides, which were horrible, like listening to the, I used a dictaphone a little bit during that time, and it was just like me crying the entire time, trying to collect the data because I was just so sad. Now I'm a lot more used to the idea of death in the forest, but at the time it was quite challenging, but it was really cool. And I'm a big fan of colobus. I think they're the coolest, like all the different species are so interesting. Okay, my research approach. I think a lot of primatologists do this, especially nowadays. We kind of rely, as behavioral ecology kind of primatologists, we rely on behavioral observation. So you go in the field for a year at a time, usually for a PhD. You need to observe the primates enough to collect the data on them. And a lot of us also collect physiological components. So for me, you'll see I collect poop to look at stable isotope analyses, to look at infant feeding, lactation patterns, infant care and development. So these two components of the behavioral and the physiological come together to sort of describe different aspects of infancy and of mothering and infant care. And from there, I'm actually really interested in sort of these two approaches. I really love the concept of, like I said, I'm an anthropologist and I really like big picture stuff. So I'm really into kind of uncovering ancestral models. So understanding through comparisons with chimpanzees, for instance, understanding how, or kind of going step by step from understanding how we went from a chimpanzee-like model of infant care, mothering, alloparental care to one that is very much a human one, contemporary humans, which I'll talk about in just a second as well. But then on the other hand, I'm also interested in this variation because mothers are all different in chimpanzees, just like they are in humans as well. And so understanding why this variation occurs and how it can lead to differences in what we call fitness outcomes, like the number of babies that a female can have in her lifetime, how many babies survive, how many die. So this variation is there for a reason, and it can be quite interesting to study as well. And so this is an interesting, I put this up just to kind of contextualize this primatological research within this anthropology lens. So when this Time magazine article came out, it kind of brought people together in this very polarizing opinions. Like some people saying, whoa, this kid is way too big to still be breastfeeding. Why is this mother like, traumatizing her child? And other people kind of being like, yeah, good for her. Like, breastfeed as long as possible. And just the fact that we have these polarizing opinions kind of shows how not only that a variation exists, but also shows how little we really understand what's optimal, or if there even is such a thing as optimal infant feeding or optimal infant care. And so primatological research through comparisons with our non-human primates can help us understand sort of the biological and social foundations of maybe what underlies human infant feeding and care. Right. And so, so like I said, my research is on mothers and infants, and I study them in different primates and apes, but also in the colobines. I have students now studying baboons, potentially also students who may work in Costa Rica studying different platyrrhines. And so studying primates can help us better understand the biosocial adaptations that underlie infant care and development in humans. And this can help us understand and make sense of this crazy broad variation in the ways that humans take care of our children. So humans are interesting because we have this cooperative infant care. Everyone's involved in taking care of kids. We have relatively short lactation periods. We wean our kids pretty fast compared to the other apes. Like a chimpanzee will wean their kid around usually 5 years old, but humans, I would say the average is around 2.5 if we look at hunter-gatherer populations. And so that's quite quick. Fathers are often very involved. So often people will have kids together as a couple, and paternal care is a lot higher than in any of the apes, for instance. It does occur in some of the other primates. What else do we have? Oh, we have complementary feeding, which is like we start, and it's obligate, meaning that at 6 months, the energy available in milk for the baby is not enough. So usually at around 6 months, you have to start feeding babies these highly nutritious, easily digestible foods. So we start giving them like mashed banana and yam and all that stuff. And that's pretty unique to humans as well. And that's like a very interesting adaptation that humans have. And so there's several different components in human infant feeding care that really interest me. And so I look at the other primates and make comparisons to try to track, like, when did this adaptation evolve, within the last several million years? Was it an ancient adaptation that a lot of primates have? Yeah, so that's kind of where my research is. And of course I mentioned poop, but poop is very precious. That's a live photo of me collecting a fecal sample. And you're fighting off these guys. Of course, I wouldn't collect this sample because it's old, but oftentimes you have to get to the poop before the insects do. So I collect poop in the field to look at stable isotopes, which help me track infant nutrition and weaning patterns, because you can look at how long infants are drinking milk from the mother by looking at stable isotopes in poop. It's very basic. I dry the poop in this like food poop dehydrator. In the lab, I mash it all up and get a nice little powder. Then I go to a stable isotope lab and analyze it for stable carbon and nitrogen isotopes. Okay, various highlights of my research outcomes. Just very broadly, I found that the pattern of lactation in chimpanzees is very similar to humans in that it plateaus. I think there's these suppositions that lactation is kind of like a peak, and that you need to like wean kids fast in humans and in other primates. So it like reaches a peak and then you have to start taking milk away, but that's not the case in chimpanzees or in humans. We actually see that for several years, mothers are kind of consistently making milk, and it provides this like foundational, secure base of nutrition for babies well into them being able to be weaned later. I also found comfort nursing, the idea that some chimpanzee kids will continue to make nipple contacts up until they're like 7, 8 years old. And they're not necessarily getting milk from the mother anymore, but mothers will still encourage it and the babies still need the contact. And so the idea is that the kids it's really about behaving like an infant to have this socio-emotional support from the mother. Like it benefits the mother and the kid to have this sort of bond that continues to be a bit baby-like, even if nutritionally it's no longer necessary, like the kid can eat food by himself. I found that in chimps. I looked at infant development in colobus, found that infanticide pressure really can influence how fast infants develop to escape the aggression from males. I'm also really interested in kind of, I found some sex differences that male chimp infants are a lot harder to take care of for the poor mothers. Yeah. And I really wanted to kind of also mention here, because I've talked about all my professional kind of who am I as a professional primatologist, but I think what really I find interesting is that much like art, when we say art imitates life, or Lana Del Rey says life imitates art, but in the same idea, it's science imitates life and life imitates science. They really reflect each other. And so not to get, because I'm an oversharer, so I'm going to try not to overshare too much, but I really wanted to kind of highlight how my own personal life really has shaped the kinds of questions that I've asked. So I am an intersex woman, so I'm also I have a child that I had on my own, so I'm a single mom by choice, and I had him through fertility treatments. And at the same time, my child is also autistic. And all of these things are quite interesting because my fascination with infants and babies very, to me now, maybe I didn't know at the time, but I think now to me really came from this sort of idea that because I am intersex, I couldn't have kids biologically on my own. And so already that fascination with infants shaped the kinds of subjects that I wanted to study. And similarly, you know, the concept of infant nutrition and lactation was also very interesting to me because of my own personal experiences. And now what's interesting is as my kid is getting older, and like I said, he's maybe about 5 and he's autistic, I see how he interacts with objects and the world in such a different, not such a different way, but in a different way than maybe neurotypical kids. And so a lot of my research now, I'm moving away from infant nutrition, and I'm really interested in play. And so my current project is really looking at how infants and juveniles in chimpanzees interact with objects and tools, because they actually use tools, but in different ways than the adults. And a lot of the times it's just exploration and being silly. But they're also doing really innovative things, and they're uncovering new ways of using tools that the adults don't use. So they're actually thinking outside the box a lot more. And that's sort of in line with how I view my kid. Like I give him a toy and he won't play with it normally. He'll usually break it. But by the time before he breaks it, he's already uncovered all of these different ways to play with things. And it's quite innovative and interesting. And so, yeah, I think it's important to, and I think especially now with like very political climate things happening in the US, I think it's important to remember that people's diverse experiences often will affect the way that science is done. And this is why we often need more diverse, you know, especially in primatology, which it is problematic in a way because, you know, all of us are white. So there's a lot of white people just going to Africa and stuff. But, you know, that's why I think these EDI initiatives kind of end up needing to be important, where we bring in more and more and more diverse voices and more local people to study the primates, because they'll ask different research questions, their hypotheses will be different, and the outcomes and the results will be interesting in different ways. So I'll leave you on this quick video that you can start it probably. I'll just show you a little bit of time with it, but this is sort of this is like an ideal, you're getting best observation type of thing. You can get a video, everything's very close. Usually it's not this close, but this is like a good indication of kind of what you're observing day to day. Sorry about the motion sickness. But it's quite boring unless you're really into it. And so, you know, right now, this infant is drinking milk. I can even see that he's moving his lips, so his cheeks while he's drinking, getting the sucks. So I would be really excited to like write down how many sucks per second this is occurring. Here, this is his little sister. And she's come into groom. So that shows kind of natal attraction. So sort of alloparental care. She's grooming the baby, and so that's a slightly older sister. So this is also a very interesting thing to me as a person interested in infant care, alloparental care, mothering. And so this is like not necessarily a typical, you know, situation, but, you know, in terms of primatology, you are either really into it or you're kind of like, well, this is sort of boring, but yeah, that's what chimps are like. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm the next speaker today, and I'm Dr. Laura Bolt. So I'm an adjunct professor at University of Toronto, Mississauga, and I also work for a conservation nonprofit called Maderas Rainforest Conservancy. So I'm a member of the board of directors there, and I also teach primate field schools there several times a year. And so that nonprofit is based in Central America, and it's dedicated to protecting tropical forests. So there's a site in Nicaragua, and there's a site in Costa Rica. And the site in Costa Rica is where I do my field research. So a little bit about me. So I mentioned some of those things in terms of working at UTM, University of Toronto, Mississauga, and Maderas Rainforest Conservancy. But I did my PhD not on monkeys that are found in Costa Rica, but I went to Madagascar and I studied lemurs. So my PhD training is all on studying ring-tailed lemur vocalizations. So this is actually a selfie that I took of myself with a lemur. I was in the field by myself, so I did some, you take a lot of photos when you're there alone for months with animals. This is one of the more interesting ones. So I did study ring-tailed lemur vocalizations for my PhD in the wild in Madagascar at Baie-Saint Valley Special Reserve, where I was figuring out essentially all of the different ways that they use their vocalizations behaviorally, which had never been studied in the wild before. So a little bit about my academic path. So I think a lot of people don't come to primatology right away. You might hear a lot of stories about people maybe taking their first upper level class in primatology as, say, a third-year student in university. So my academic path is perhaps even more diverse than that. So this is a graduation photo of me, the only photo on the page, so you can see it pretty well. But I did my undergrad at Queen's University, and I did 2 degrees at the same time because I had a lot of very broad interests, and I still do. But I did a Bachelor of Music, and I specialized in flute performance. So I still perform actively as a musician and work as a freelance musician in Toronto on the side. And I also did a bachelor's degree in biology. And within biology, I was most interested in animal behavior. And I found animal behavior really fascinating, and I always have. But I did things like work in a molecular genetics lab while I was a biology student, because those were the opportunities available to me at the time. So then and I think I thought doing 2 degrees at Queen's, I would figure out maybe where my interests lay and which I wish to pursue sort of at higher levels. And at the end, I just decided I really liked them both. So the solution was a master's program that combined the 2. So I went to England, I went to the University of Cambridge, and I joined a music and science research group that I thought would allow me to combine these interests. So this is the kind of thing that you can only do at a place like Cambridge. So my master's degree is in a topic called evolutionary musicology, which is not really something that anybody knows how to categorize well. So it's not exactly music, it's not exactly biology. What is it exactly? So I was planning to stay at Cambridge and do my PhD, and I didn't end up getting full funding for that. So I ended up coming to the University of Toronto, where I did a PhD in biological anthropology. So it turns out having done a master's degree in evolutionary musicology actually is kind of anthropology adjacent. So even though I had never done a course in anthropology before and didn't even really know very much about the discipline, at the end of my time at Cambridge, I had done a general application to University of Toronto to the anthropology department, just as kind of like a backup school. I had been told Cambridge would work out. So University of Toronto is a very good school. I'm not saying you should do this as a backup school. I was very lucky and I got in and it worked out. So I did my PhD in primatology at University of Toronto, wonderful school. They all are, so I have a more diverse background than many in terms of academic path, but I think one thing that many primatologists can relate to is not everyone is 7 years old deciding, I want to be a primatologist. I'm going to do my bachelor's degree in primatology at University of Calgary, like some of the other panelists here. A lot of people, a lot of the students that I've taught in field courses in Costa Rica maybe don't realize that they like studying primates or that they're interested in that or that that's open to them until maybe their 4th year of undergrad, or maybe even at graduate level. They discover that they're interested and they want to have their first experience studying primatology. So a lot of students that I teach in the field course, they're even graduate students who have decided, maybe I want to try this, maybe this is something that could be for me. So it's fairly typical to find your interests late. And a lot of primatologists start gaining field experience or start doing research in primatology coming from very diverse academic backgrounds. Mine is maybe a little more diverse than some, but I do fit in with that in terms of many other people that I've met and talked to and students that I've taught as well. So another thing that I like to come back to is this is something that I found in my parents' basement in a box during COVID while I was visiting there. So this is a picture that I drew when I was 6 or 7. And after I saw the picture, I could actually remember drawing it in my grade 2 class. So it was the fall of grade 2, so I was 6 or 7 at the time because I have a late in the year birthday. So for those of you who can't see, this is something that my teacher wrote up here. my printing was not that neat at the time. And it says, when I grow up, I want to be a scientist, animal research. And so this is me here, high heels, because I thought that grown up women always wore high heels. I guess this is how I was socialized. And this is a bird. I think it's meant to be an exotic bird, like a parrot or something, even though the colors aren't there. And I remember that this is meant to be a panda. And then this is my signature. So it says Laura. I was not Dr. Bolt at that time. So, and then this is a picture of me in the field in Madagascar. So what's really interesting is I saw this picture and I do have all these very, very diverse general interests, but I'm like, actually, I have come full circle in terms of my interests. I've always been really interested in animal behavior. To be a scientist who does animal research or to be an animal research scientist, in my mind at that time, that meant studying animal behavior, being somewhere where the animals are, being with them in the field. And that is what I get to do, which is an incredible privilege. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my project in Costa Rica that I'm currently doing for the rest of my time. And so how does human-caused habitat change impact primate behavioral ecology is sort of the broad overarching research question for this topic. And so I mentioned that I have been teaching a primate field school in Costa Rica through Maderas Rainforest Conservancy. So this is something that I started doing essentially when I finished my PhD. So I've been teaching this primate field school for around 10 years now. And so there are 3 different species that live in the rainforest in northeastern Costa Rica where I work. So this is the white-faced capuchin monkey. This is the Central American spider monkey, and this is the mantled howler monkey. So there's 3 different species that share this rainforest space. And they all have very different behavioral ecologies. They have really different ways of interacting with the space in terms of what they eat, how they interact with one another, how they interact with the landscape. So it's been really interesting to try to study all these 3 species and their behavioral ecology in relation to a forest that is really, really heavily fragmented. So being able to study their behavior in this place where I also teach primate field schools is something that's been able to help us gain a lot of insights in terms of how their adaptations make sense in this fragmented landscape. So as I mentioned, I do research in Costa Rica, and it's a nation in Central America with a very high standard of living, also lots of development, with tourism being one of the leading industries, as well as things like growing pineapples for international export. So this is a tourist ad that you might see if you're traveling and you land at the airport in Costa Rica. There would be huge things like that all over the walls. And so Costa Rica is very good at advertising their tropical rainforests. But the reality is, if you get outside of these protected areas, and they do a good job of protecting about 25% of the land area of Costa Rica, but the rest looks like this. This is a pineapple field. So if you are a monkey that is adapted to live in trees, like all of the monkey species in Costa Rica do, there's no habitat for you. This is just a monoculture that exists on the ground. So there has been really extensive deforestation throughout most of the country outside of these protected areas since the 1970s. So what that means is all of the forests that are left are really heavily fragmented. So understanding how the monkeys are coping with this fragmentation is a really important project, given what the landscape is like in Costa Rica. So my big research question, as I do this work in Costa Rica, is how does this forest fragmentation impact the behavioral ecology of these 3 monkey species? So I've been the co-director of a project that I started at this research site, La Suerte Biological Research Station, where I teach field schools since 2015, so for around 10 years now. And so that's me in the field looking up at a monkey using binoculars. The 3 monkey species are all very arboreal, so often they're quite high up in the trees, which means that you need good binoculars to be able to see them there. And this is a group of students who are all observing them as well. This is a spider monkey as it moves through the landscape. So this is a picture of what the research station looks like. So this is a Google map kind of bird eye view here. And this is where the station is located in Costa Rica. So this is the northeastern part of the country. It's known as the banana belt of Costa Rica, or the pineapple belt. It's the agricultural area. So if you do a trip to Costa Rica, people always ask, where is my field site? And I explain where it is and where the nearest cities are. And they say, oh yeah, I've never heard of that. This isn't a touristy area. It's a place where there's a lot of agricultural work done. And so this is a very small forest fragment, and all around it is deforested, and it's pineapple fields, it's roads, it's cattle pastures. So this small forest fragment is only about 3 square kilometers. So one of the big questions I've asked in my research is, how does this forest fragmentation impact the population structure of the monkeys found at this site? And so I've done some work so far on howler monkey population structure. Over a few field seasons, with some research assistants, we did a very detailed population count. And so this is a map of the study area of the site, and each of these little dots represents a different place where we saw a different monkey group that we studied for at least half an hour at a time. So there are 11 different monkey groups if you count up all the different colors that you see. And then there's also some little square pegs. Those represent solitary males. Howler monkeys are a species that lives in groups, but they have a life stage where both males and females are alone for a while after they reach sexual maturity. What we found is that there is a very, very high population count. There's a very, very dense population in this small forest fragment. So it's 109.5 monkeys per square kilometer, which is the highest recorded population density for this species in the world. So just to give you some context, every other place where population density has been determined for this species, the mantled howler monkey, the number is between 5 and 30 monkeys per square kilometer. So this is more than 3 times as densely populated as the most densely populated other population that's been quantified. So this tells us a lot about the monkey species. Firstly, they are able to survive at this level of density for a few years at least. And if we also look at what's happening in the general area, so there's this forest fragment where I work, and it's surrounded by fields that look like that. So there's basically no habitat for the monkeys. And there really aren't very many places where they can travel to other forests. So essentially, as their forest has been cut down, they've all crowded into this forest because there's no other place for them to go. So that leads to a lot of competition for things like access to food, access to living in a group, and access to different kinds of trees. And this probably is influencing a lot about their behavior. So long-term, there's also some concerns for population viability. So we know that the forest has been able to support this density of monkeys for more than a 5-year period, for example, but we don't know what's going to happen 5 years from now. It's possible the forest could reach carrying capacity, and then the monkey population might completely die out or just suddenly and drastically reduce. So long-term, there should be some kind of corridor so that they're able to travel to other forest fragments. Another big question that I've asked in my research is, we know that this is happening in terms of the high population density. And we also know some ecological characteristics about the site. And so one big question is there a difference in monkey behavior when they're in different areas of the site? So do they show behavioral differences when they're in areas of the forest that have been more impacted by humans compared to those that have been less impacted by humans? So this brings me to the concept of edge effects, which I'll just talk about quickly. So essentially, this is a forest edge. So there is a barbed wire fence, there's forest on one side, and on the other side, this is cattle pasture. So this is at the border of the land where I work in Costa Rica. So you can see that reflected on the map here. This would be the border of the forest, and then this cattle pasture would be on the other side. So that would be a human-caused forest edge, essentially. So the land is clear-cut up until the barbed wire fence at this particular site. And so what we would also see for the first 100 meters or so, once we go into the forest, are differences in the characteristics of, first of all, the abiotic characteristics. So the amount of moisture and the amount of light that would reach the plants, which in turn would impact the kinds of plants and trees that would grow there. Maybe different species of trees would favor those conditions. Maybe the soil is different, so different species of trees would grow, for example. Or maybe the same species would grow, but the trees would be smaller because of these differences in soil and wind and sunlight and moisture. And if the plants are different, that changes the ranging patterns of the animals who might rely on those plants for food or for shelter. So this would lead to differences in what you might find within this transition zone or forest edge. So at La Suerte, the research site where I work, there's two different kinds of transition zones that we see. So there's these human-caused transition zones, this very sharp, clear-cut area at the boundary of the forest. But there's also a river that runs all the way through the field site. So on either side of the river, there's also a transition zone in terms of vegetation, but this is a naturally occurring one. So you might expect really close to water, for example, that the soil would have more moisture. So this is something that we might see there. And then you would expect differences in vegetation to be present for the first, say, 100 meters or so on either side of the river. And so we would see differences in plants. We would also see differences in animals. And that is the case there. So this map shows what the forest edges look like at this site. So this is the study area of the site. And the really dark gray area all the way around the outside is the anthropogenic or human-caused edge, which extends about 100 meters into the forest. This black line that we see running all the way through the site represents the La Suerte River. And so this gray area on either side of the river for 100 meters represents the riparian or river edge that shows these differences in characteristics. And then the white forest area just represents continuous forest that hasn't been altered by human interference and isn't close enough to the river to feel those effects. And then the very darkest parts that are shaded almost black here represent combined areas of edge, where it's both human altered due to the anthropogenic edge, plus altered due to the river. So two kinds of edge effects are happening in those places. And so I figured out that this forest fragment has these different kinds of edge effects present throughout the forest. So it's a really, really good site for investigating edge effects. And how are edge effects impacting plants? How are edge effects impacting primate species that live there? So in terms of the vegetation, it definitely shows patterns as well. So essentially in all of the human altered areas, the trees are smaller and there are fewer different species of trees present. There's lower species richness. In the areas that have not been altered by humans, so near the river edge and in the interior forest area, the trees are larger and there are more different species of trees present, generally speaking. So mantled howler monkeys, which are one of the three species that I study, live in social groups. So those groups can have up to around 15 individuals, although we have seen some bigger groups at the site. And they don't like to move when they don't have to. They are called energy minimizers because they eat diets that consist of a lot of leaves, which are not very nutritious compared to other things that they could eat, like fruit. And they also don't have any kind of specialized digestion system that helps them to extract all of the potential nutrients from the leaves. So that means that they end up compensating behaviorally. So they end up moving as little as possible. But they do have a loud vocalization called a howl. And this is where they get their name, howler monkey, from. So these are male specific, and they make this long vocalization, potentially so that they can space out groups and not have to physically move and interact with other groups. And so in my research, I found that at La Suerte, they prefer the riparian edge. They prefer the 100 meters on either side of the river to other habitat areas. This is something that's preferable for them, probably because there's more of their preferred food from preferred feeding trees available there. The white-faced capuchin monkey is one of the other monkey species that I study. These are small-bodied and they have the most generalist diets of the three monkeys there. They'll tend to eat a little bit of fruit, a little bit of leaves, some flowers. And if there are fruit growing from invasive trees or shrubs, like small sugary fruits, they will tend to eat those, even though the other species will stay away from them. And so we have either 3 or 4 social groups in the study area at La Suerte, depending on the time of year. And in my research, I found that they prefer the anthropogenic edge at La Suerte. They prefer this human-caused edge about 100 meters from the clear-cut zone, or they prefer to stay within 100 meters. Probably because there are food sources there that they like to access, like some invasive plants that have sort of been carried over from neighboring agricultural areas, and they will eat those kinds of plants, whereas those aren't found further into the forest. And finally, we have the Central American spider monkey at the site. These are the largest monkeys, and they are frugivores. They like to eat fruit that is lipid rich and from fruit that is from very big mature trees. So something like a very tall ficus tree would be a preferred food item or a preferred feeding tree for spider monkeys. And so they have a fission-fusion social system. So you might see a spider monkey by itself, or you might see it in a large group of more than 10. So I've seen groups of as large as 17 at this site before. And so we know that there's at least 40 individual spider monkeys at the site, although they're hard to quantify because they move around a great deal and it's hard to know where they all might be at any one time. And in my research, I found that they don't seem to show any preference for any area of the forest at La Suerte. They don't prefer the edges, they don't prefer the interior, probably because the kinds of trees that they prefer to feed on are found throughout the site. There's some very large ficus trees in edge areas as well as interior areas. So one focus of my research over the last few years especially has been behavioral edge effects. So we know where the monkeys are in the forest and we know what the vegetation characteristics are in these different forest areas. But what are the monkeys doing when they're in these different forest areas? How are they changing their behavior, or are they changing their behavior? So over the last 8 years or so, I've been collecting behavioral data on all 3 monkey species. And I have the most on howler monkeys because they are easier to get a lot of data on since they tend to stay in one place. And capuchin monkeys, they were easier at the beginning. And then unfortunately with COVID, I couldn't visit the research site for about 2 years and they lost a lot of habituation, which has made them much harder to study since 2021 when I started going back. Spider monkeys, conversely, were very, very shy and non-habituated when I started working there. But since COVID, they have seemed to have lost their fear of humans. So spider monkeys are much easier to study since 2021. So I'm now collecting, along with my students and research assistants, much more data on spider monkeys than on capuchin monkeys, which is a big change from before. And so I'm going to talk about just a few of my research findings from this project on behavioral edge effects. So one thing that I've looked at is howler monkey vocalizations and how being in different areas of the forest might impact their long calling or howling behavior. So as I mentioned, they make these male-specific howls or long vocalizations. This is something that many primate species have, and also many other animal species. So not just primates, but many other mammals, and also there's sex-specific vocalizations in species like different bird species, for example. One kind of open question is why howler monkeys howl. Different people had done different research investigating different functional reasons why they might howl. And so at this particular forest, I wanted to investigate the ecological resource defense hypothesis. So the idea that when monkeys are in areas of richer food resources, they will howl more as a way of defending those access to those resources, to let other groups know that they're already there and this area is occupied. So I carried out this work and I found that there was a difference in the human disturbed areas that had poorer quality vegetation compared to these undisturbed areas near the river and in forest interior that had higher quality vegetation according to what monkeys like to eat. So howl bouts are longer when monkeys are in these undisturbed areas and trees are taller and there's a greater number of different tree species. Howl bouts are shorter in the human disturbed areas that are negatively affected by this fragmentation. So another key point is that howling is not only different in these different forest areas, but it differs depending on the type of forest edge that you're in. So there's a difference between the naturally occurring forest edge at the sides of the river and the human-caused forest edge. So that tells us that it isn't just some kind of characteristic of how sound travels, like they're modifying the way that they howl when they're next to an open space, for example. It tells us that it does seem to have something to do with more factors related to forest ecology, potentially. So I've also looked at a lot of different questions and a lot of different other kinds of behavior in ecology in relation to these forest areas. So I'll just take you through a few of these other findings quickly. Another thing that I looked at was feeding behavior in howler monkeys and how it changes when they're in different areas of the forest at La Suerte. So I found that when they were in human disturbed areas, they tended to feed from smaller feeding trees. So the trees are smaller, and the trees are larger when they are in undisturbed areas, so river edge as well as forest interior. I also found that there was a difference in the plant parts that they ate. So when they are in human altered areas, they eat more stems, which are parts of plants that have fewer nutrients. So it might be considered less desirable foods or fallback foods, foods that the animals will eat if there aren't enough other food items available that might be more desirable or more nutritious. So they're eating more stems and they're eating fewer leaves. Leaves would be a more desirable food item in this instance. And they're also feeding from a greater number of different plant families when they are in anthropogenic edge. And that's an interesting finding because overall in the forest, there are fewer different tree species present in anthropogenic edge, is what I've determined from research on just the vegetation itself. At river edge, conversely, they're feeding from a smaller number of different plant and tree families, and they're also eating more leaves when they're there and fewer stems. So they're eating higher quality food overall when they are in these undisturbed forest areas, forest interior and river edge. And so the finding that they're eating from a lot of different kinds of tree families when they're in the anthropogenic edge was kind of an interesting finding. And but so the way to think about that is looking at other research on howler monkeys done at other sites. It's been found that they are actually very picky when they have the chance to be. So they'll preferentially feed from only the plant families that they like if they have a wide enough variety of choice. So in these forest areas that have greater vegetation species richness, they are able to be pickier and just feed from their preferred families. But when they're in these human modified areas, they have fewer preferred families available. So what they do is feed from little bits of lots of less preferred plant families. So they're feeding from a total different number of, a greater number of different species and different families, even though simply because that's what's available as fallback foods. So finally, I've also taken a look at social behavior for all three species. So I found that when they're in anthropogenic edge compared to forest interior, so you can see anthropogenic edge represented here, and each of the three species is represented by a different color and shape of dot. So capuchin monkeys you can see as the little gray triangles, the palest gray. Spider monkeys, intermediate color. Howler monkeys are the blackest dot. So this just represents places where my research assistants and I, each dot represents 30 minutes of behavioral sampling, sort of over a number of years of studying them for social behavior. So what we found was that they do change their social behavior when they're in different forest areas. So spiders have less social behavior or a lower rate of social behavior when they're in forest edge compared to forest interior. Capuchins had different kinds of social behavior. So the kinds of social behaviors that we looked at were things like grooming and things like play behavior, things like vocalizations, things like agonistic behavior. So aggression and submissive behaviors that are based in fighting, different kinds of behaviors like that. So capuchins changed that. Howlers didn't seem to have a difference in their social behavior, however. So overall, the big take-home message from a lot of my research findings so far is that monkeys do change their behavioral ecology when they're in these different areas of a fragmented forest. They are able to survive at pretty high density in the fragment, but maybe one of the ways that they're able to do that is by compensating in relation to the quality of vegetation that they're finding and other forest characteristics when they're in different areas of this site. And so doing further research to better understand this is important, not only for understanding the monkeys in this forest, but for understanding habitat change throughout Central America in general. So these three species range not only in Costa Rica, but also in places like Nicaragua. Nicaragua right now is just now deforesting their country. So things that have been done in the 1970s in Costa Rica are now ongoing in places like Nicaragua. So understanding what the monkeys need and what their behavior is like when they're in these regions can give us tools to help mitigate their population decline or mitigate the destruction of resources that they might depend on. So in terms of future research, I have a lot of ongoing projects at the site. One thing I've been looking at for the last 5 years are primate predators. So this is a camera trap image of an ocelot. We have a lot of ocelots at the site, as well as other large-bodied predators. So understanding what predators are doing at this site, which is really, really population dense, is something that I'm working on right now. And this is another project that's ongoing where we're looking at another way of censusing the total number of howler monkeys at this site without having to do a detailed population count. So this is by having people standing in different areas of the site and figuring out where howling is coming from and doing a howling triangulation method. So that's something that I've tried doing for the last few summers, and also done some collaborative work on at a different site in Costa Rica called La Selva. So that's an ongoing project that I'm continuing to work on now. And that's all for now, but I welcome your questions later.
Great. This is fun, Brogan. Thank you for organizing. And thanks to the folks in the fourth space for hosting, Doug and Bertie and Jax and everyone. We really appreciate you. Just waiting for the slide to come up. No problem. So my primate pursuit over the last many years has been about primate abilities and disabilities. And I've done research at the Awajishima Monkey Center in Japan for most of my career as a primatologist. So, oh right, I have to advance slides. And my just like the big button advances. Okay. So as others have spoken about, whenever we're doing field work, whenever we're going through a career as a primatologist, as a researcher, as an academic, there's always a lot of people involved and a lot of people to thank. So this is the first of two such slides with the list that includes some of the same people you've heard about, with Dr. Linda Fedigan, who was my PhD supervisor, and Dr. Mary Pavelka and Dr. Pascal Sicot from the University of Calgary, and also Dr. Lisa Gould, who studies ring-tailed lemurs and is at the University of Victoria, and I did my master's with her, as well as my many valuable colleagues in Japan who I've worked with over the last many years, especially Dr. Masayuki Nakamichi at Osaka University, and Dr. Kazunori Yamada, Dr. Yukai Gashi at Osaka University as well, or now Dr. Kaigashi is elsewhere doing his postdoc. But also, and maybe mostly, the owners of the Monkey Center, Toshikazu and Asami Nobahara, have facilitated my being able to go there for so many years, to their home and their kind of privately run tourist business that I'm going to tell you about. And this is just a kind of collage snapshot of many of those people and many of my students and collaborators and colleagues. I also do work in Brazil now with Dr. Renata Ferreira. And so I'm not going to talk about that research right now, but there's, many involved. And in the middle there, you see Brogan and my other PhD student, Megan Joyce, who has worked at Awajishima as well. So yeah, I guess some of you talked about your past and what brought you to primatology. And I was one of those kids who was like, from as long as I can remember, I want to study animal behavior. That's the thing I wanted to do. And then as a teenager, I kind of went on a side quest into like environmental activism and defending the West Coast rainforests, and decided I wanted to do my undergrad in women's studies, sort of I guess a critical intersectional feminist perspective. So in my mind, those things were very linked, and I see a link between the things that we are doing to the planet and the destruction that's going on the planet, and the things that we are doing to animals and the things that we are doing to people, and those kinds of justices are really connected. But partway through my undergraduate degree, where I was studying a lot of different critical issues especially around human disability, I took a primatology class again and was like, oh, right, this is what I need to do. So I, spent a bunch of time taking more biology classes and taking some stats and kind of getting up to speed in order to do an interdisciplinary master's degree in primatology, which was based in the anthropology department, but was also geography and biology. I had sort of co-supervisor with Lisa Gould, but committee members in those other departments. And all of that with the goal of doing my PhD with Dr. Linda Fettigan, because as an undergrad, when I'd taken the primatology course, I was so inspired and so excited, and also horrified at the language that was being used in primatology around sort of essentialist views of human evolution and kind of racist and sexist terms. And I was like, is this what everyone's doing? And it turns out, no, it's not what everyone's doing. I read a book by Donna Haraway, who's social scientist, and she profiled Linda Fettigan. I was like, okay, this is the person I want to work with. She brings in female primates. She looks at evolution from a much broader perspective. And I was like, here we go. So all of that, because I was doing disability as an undergrad and I was working on humans, and my mom actually met a professor from Japan. My mom's an ethnobotanist. She studies plants and indigenous people's use of plants and works with indigenous folks on the West Coast. But she met a professor from Japan who brought her to Japan for a conference, and they went to the Awajishima Monkey Center. And my mom, in her way of knowing these things, was like, here's where you should go do your research. And she was right. It's located just there in that green belt along the edge. And there's many, many things that make this one of the most special places in the world. But one of the things that makes it really special and unusual is that a lot of the monkeys have physical disabilities, like impairments. So a lot of the babies are born like Nina there, without hands or with malformed hands and feet. And so that allowed me to kind of bring in my perspectives on disability studies and come to this place to also study primate and animal behavior. And the Awajishima Monkey Center was established in 1967 by these wonderful people. Oba-san, she's, oh my goodness, is she 90 now? She is the most like Genki woman you'll ever meet. She sweeps the monkey center every day. She's there every day feeding the monkeys still. Nakahashi Sensei died a few years ago, unfortunately, and we miss him, but we didn't have any language in common when I first started going in 1999, but I really fell in love with him as a person. He's so wise and caring about the monkeys. And one of the things he did was raise one of the disabled babies who didn't have hands or feet and wouldn't have been able to survive at all. And he sort of, in the interpretation and the pictures and the stories about how much he loved that monkey and how much he cared about this population, yeah, really a lovely man. So this family has really welcomed us over the years, and we've gone, and it's been one of my great pleasures going there to be able to share this amazing place with Brogan and with Megan, and hopefully with some other students in the future. And this is the family of the Monkey Center, Toshikazu Nobahara in the front holding the picture of the monkey that my daughter Jane made. And Sammy just behind him, his wife, and their daughter Saki-chan was a baby in 1999 when I first went, and and now she's grown up and has her own kids. So it's kind of amazing. It makes me feel old. But this is the kind of heart of the Monkey Center, at least from a human perspective, though maybe not from a monkey's perspective. This is where the monkeys get fed by the Nobaharas, and there's about 500 monkeys that live free range in the forests around the Monkey Center, but they come down here every day, almost all of the year. There's about 2 months when there's a lot of food in the forest and they don't, but the rest of the year they come down and they're fed at this building and in the fields around. And yeah, and this, in addition to the just amazingness of being able to interact with the monkeys in such a coexistence kind of way, here's some examples of the disabilities that are prevalent in this population. So really, short answer to the question, we don't totally know why, but it's probably linked to organic chlorine pesticides, persistent organic chlorine pesticides in the environment, some sort of susceptibility to them that may be due to having a small genetic pool in the population partly. But it's still a bit of an open question, although there are links to provision feeding, that is, feeding these monkeys in Japan. There were other groups that had congenital limb malformations as well, especially in the 70s. And more recently, it's pretty much just a Wajishima where it persists in any kind of large numbers. And they are large numbers still. Between 1967 and 2007, there were 16% of infants born with some kind of limb malformation. And some of them are pretty minor. You can't see because my picture, there we go. The little one in the middle there, you can just see absence of like one finger, but also much more extensive malformations like Monmo here crawling in the front. And so, normally you would expect in a human or primate population, way less than 1% of the population that might experience something like this. So, this is still quite a large number. Of course, it's complicated because this population relies on provision feeding now to sustain itself. So they can't just stop provision feeding the population. There's not only human livelihoods at stake, but it's also, this population is dependent upon that. Yeah, but from a disability research point of view, this, like, in addition to the kind of question of why, there's so many questions about how they manage and how do they adjust their behaviors to compensate for the absence of hands and feet. Are these malformations like disabling in terms of how it impacts their lives? Are there social consequences to the disabilities? How are they treated by others in their group? Are they stressed? Is it stressful to have a disability or a physical impairment as a Japanese macaque living in this environment? And how do mothers raise their infants? Like a baby macaque would usually cling to its mom almost right from the get-go. I've watched a baby macaque being born who was literally climbed up its mother with its hands. And if you don't have hands, you're not clinging, or if you have hands that are missing, have absent digits, you're not clinging to your mom. So how does that impact the parenting? So many questions. And then these questions have broader implications. And this is sort of the, I guess, things that drive my research fundamentally underneath. I'm really interested in how behavioral measures can indicate resilience and what the kind of these impacts of environmental change, how are they impacting species at the individual level, at the species level, and to understand how animals can behave flexibly and plastically in these like environments that are really changed by people and by rapid human-induced global environmental change. So I'm going to go through 25-ish years of research really quickly. What we have found: mothers do compensate and provide extra care for disabled infants. So they will hold an infant up to nurse, like use an arm and hold them in position. And sometimes there was even one who kind of had a very disabled infant who was born in 2004. And she sandwiched her routinely between a rock and herself as kind of a way of like holding the baby up. And it's really what it takes about a week or two and the baby gets enough strength to be able to hold itself in position. But at the beginning, that mom's arm is really critical. They also carry them, and they carry them in a ventral, like tummy position for much longer if they can't cling. So that's Teruko, the little baby there. Baby is Biwa, Teruko's the mom. And she's holding that baby like that to her front. And the baby is about a year old in that picture. And usually the mom wouldn't be carrying a baby like that by a year at all. But they do, and they figure it out. And the babies have quite a high survival rate. And they also, and that's a shout out to Megan and Brogan. Megan, who's doing a project right now on infants with disability as part of other projects with her PhD, some of which also link to Julie's research, and I'm not even going to talk about that because there's so many things. They also find ways of compensating individually, like this, that's Ribbon, she's walking bipedally, she walks habitually bipedally. Maybe you don't know because maybe you haven't met a Japanese macaque. Usually they walk on all fours. They can walk bipedally for short times. She walks bipedally pretty much all the time. And there's lots of other ways that they find individually appropriate ways of compensating and managing and behaving flexibly and plastically. There are some kind of consequences. So really quickly, the disabled females spent more time resting and less time engaged in social activity. But from what I could tell, that's really driven by their need for more rest, not by any kind of social choice or like not being chosen as social partners. They were chosen equally as social partners in grooming and had kind of, there was no kind of discrimination, if you like, for disabled monkeys. So they generally overall had very undifferentiated social treatment. However, there were some small effects in terms of dominance rank. So Japanese macaques have really linear dominance rank. In females, it's really linked to who you're related to, who your mom is, who your sisters are. In males, it's not. In females, when you controlled for what we know about where they should be in the rank order based on like their kin relationships, there was a slight loss of dominance rank if you were a disabled female. In males, there was no effective dominance on dominance rank at all. So that's one kind of somewhat consequence of disability for adult females. But you know, overall, they're able to compensate really well. They're able to behave flexibly, find individually appropriate ways of doing things. And there's sort of, they mostly live in the group as other monkeys do. So we kind of were wondering, okay, that's good. Are we missing something? Maybe we need to look at other kind of scales of analysis. So I had a student, Jenny, who did this really cool sequence analysis on grooming. So you saw grooming, some of the other primates grooming. It's really an important primate behavior, kind of picking through the coat, looking for louse eggs. What we found is that disabled females will groom differently than non-disabled females. They will use kind of alternate pathways to grooming. This one, you know, a much simpler pathway for grooming. So they're maintaining the social function of grooming, even though they are slightly less efficient at removing louse eggs than non-disabled females. The other thing, the other level that we did look at is cortisol, which is a stress hormone. And we found no cortisol effect at all. So are disabled monkeys stressed? No, apparently not really. Not any more than others. But if you're a lower ranking monkey, you were a little more stressed than the higher ranking monkeys in the group. So there was a rank effect, although independent of the disability effect. The only kind of really significant disability related response that we found was that mothers of disabled infants had higher cortisol levels. So you can see right there, that's a statistically significant effect where mothers were kind of probably more stressed as they were raising a disabled infant than other mothers and than pregnant or non-pregnant females. Which kind of tracks, right? Like I felt like that was a result that made sense. I mean, I think in general, maybe as moms doing field work in primatology, perhaps our cortisol levels are higher than most. I remember Mary Pavelka at one point talking about just bathing in cortisol as she was going through her academic career. And I do feel like that has also been my experience in many ways. And, you know, Brogan suggested we talk about our experiences as field primatologists, and my experience as an academic and a primatologist is not separate from my experience as a mom and a parent. Like those things are, and of course our careers and the universities and sort of the world treats it as though we should really separate those things completely, and you know that our professional lives shouldn't interact, and that's, you know, that's not reality. I had we had our oldest child when I was in my master's degree. So Shay, the tall one there, was a master's baby. And then Jane was born during my PhD, and the twins were postdoc babies. And, you know, there's been lots of challenges associated with being a parent and a primatologist and a field primatologist. And I've been really lucky in so many ways. I have a, you know, supportive partner who's really involved in parenting. I have a field site where I can bring my kids, and supportive people who love them and who treat us like family, which is amazing. And I've had mentors and colleagues who've been really supportive over the years. And still, there's lots we need to do, and we need to keep calling for change and normalize like breaks in our CVs and normalize different timelines and trajectories. My timeline has had nothing to do with your standard academic timeline, I think, in terms of how long everything has taken over the years. And, you know, I mean, I finished my PhD in 2010, just after Julie, and started here in 2017. And I did a postdoc, sort of officially, I guess, a 2-year postdoc at McGill with Simon Reeder in between, that I sort of stretched out with a maternity leave in between. And, you know, but it's, yeah, I guess we really need to keep agitating to recognize a variety of pathways as legitimate. And we need to do that for the next generation of primatologists, because these photos were taken when Brogan was pregnant at the SWABEC, the animal behavior conference that was at UDAM recently, and Brogan is now back from mat leave. And do you want to come and take over?
I'm not sure which mic I'm using.
I don't know.
I'm good? Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah,
Where's,
I think,
did I make that go?
no, it's still up. I
But
think
it's not
people
there.
online can see it. Okay. Yeah, so I'm just gonna briefly talk about my research just for the interest of time. Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, woohoo! Yeah, so we published an article right before I went on maternity leave. It was a systematic review of all non-human primate literature on physical impairment and disability. So the title was Primates and Disability, Behavioral Flexibility and Implications for Resilience to Environmental Change. I don't have time to go through the whole review, but some of the really interesting findings, we went through 2 databases and found all of the disabilities that were reported in academic literature that was spontaneous disability. So that means that it wasn't induced by a researcher for a medical purpose. So these are like wild and free-ranging primates and apes that have an impairment of some sort. And we found that 60% of the articles linked the disability to humans. So it could be gunshot wounds, power line burns, it could be hitting them with a car, or snare trap injuries, things like that. Also, oh, that didn't work. There we go. So there was 3 key themes that we also found in the review. And so out of the articles, 70 of them described some kind of behavior or social relationships. We went through those, and 64% of them described behavioral flexibility. So that's modifying the individual's behavior in order to compensate for their disability. So an example from the chimpanzee literature that I found interesting was their space use changed. So if they had a hand injury and couldn't use their arms, they would spend more time on the ground. Makes sense. If they had a foot disability or an injury of the leg, they would spend all their time in the trees using their arms. We also found that 19% of the articles described some kind of innovation. An example of this that I found really interesting was Tinka. He was a chimpanzee that had his hands were both physically impaired from snare traps, so he couldn't use his hands, but he was itchy, right? So he'd grab a hanging vine with his foot, stretch it tightly, and he'd scratch his back and his head with the vine. The other chimpanzees that were not disabled in the community saw him doing this, and they started doing it too. So it spread through the whole community. But we also saw maternal care in 33% of the articles, and Sarah already talked about that a bit. An interesting example from the chimpanzee literature again There was 2 wild chimpanzees. The mother had slight hand disabilities, but her daughter couldn't use her legs at all. So she'd spend all her time in the trees. But if there's a clearing in the trees, the mother would put the 7-year-old chimpanzee daughter on her back, walk across until she got to the trees again. There was also 14% of the article showed some kind of conspecific care. So that's within the species, within the group. An interesting example of that was rhesus macaques. There was a blind infant in the group, and a 2-year-old male and an infertile female would help with the blind infant. They'd even carry it with them to the feeding area and the water, and they even kept caring for that infant even after the mother had another infant. So I've got some research in progress right now. So I'm using a method called fractal analysis. Just quickly, it looks at the behavioral patterns and it can see really subtle changes in the behavior that can indicate a change in health or potentially stress that that individual is facing. So I'm at Awajishima, the place where Sarah was talking about, and I'm doing a comparison between the disabled and non-disabled adults. As Sarah also talked about, we don't observe that they're keeping up with the group. They're doing behaviors, but they're modifying the behaviors. So they don't seem stressed out at all by their disabilities. And even the cortisol showed that not all the adults are stressed, right? So I'm going to use this comparison to see if this fractal analysis method can look at the subtle changes in the behavior and see if maybe are they stressed out by their disabilities, or maybe they've adapted and compensated and they're not. I'm also doing a comparison between different groups. So I went to Granby Zoo here in Quebec. I went to Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago in the United States. I went to a breeding colony in Japan, the free-ranging Awajishima group, and then a completely wild group in Koshima. I'm going to do a comparison and see if when the environment changes, does that change, make subtle changes in their behavior that maybe potentially stress them out or would change this behavioral pattern. So for instance, if they're in a zoo where it's a smaller space without a 3-dimensional area, so no trees to climb, are they going to have a different behavior and complexity of behavior to, let's say, the completely wild group that has access to trees? So yeah, that's very brief. I only have some preliminary results right now. So when I was in Japan at Awajishima in 2019, there was a monkey named Johnny, and he's one of my favorites. He's like this little jock monkey, and you could tell it's him from like a mile away. He's like strutting around, his tail's up, he's like shaking branches. You're like, well, Johnny, geez, you know what I mean? And he was just very energetic. And when I went back in 2022, he was the alpha. So he managed to get to the alpha status of a 500 group monkey system. But anyway, so halfway through the season, I'm watching him, observing him doing a behavior sample, and all of a sudden he fell on the ground and started having what appeared to be a stroke or a seizure. And it's, again, I was like recording myself with the vocal notes like you were, and I freak out. I re-listened to it like a month ago, and it's, yeah, it was very shocking. And after that, it was really sad. He couldn't walk properly, and it really affected him. He ended up, someone else became alpha during that time, and he ended up passing away later. So I looked, using fractal analysis, I looked at the behavior samples from 2019 when he was healthy and before the stroke and after, and I found a moderate effect size difference between those. So we're able to see that subtle change, and there is a difference, but these are very preliminary and I'm still working on it. So just some quick acknowledgements. I'd like to really thank the Public Scholars Program because they sponsored this event and allowed us to have it. So thank you so much. And I know we still have the space for a while, so we're gonna go a bit over the time, which is fine. But we're just gonna take a few minutes right now to set up the table for the discussion and get some water. So if you want some coffee or tea, it's at the back, but we're gonna start in like a minute. So don't take too long, okay? So we're going to questions in a minute. Yeah. Does anyone need a? Yeah.
I deserve a cup. I don't know. I need a. I want results. Oh yeah. I like when people take the time. That's why I love people to listen. Yeah, I'm just gonna pour water. You're all gonna be in stable for the kids. Yeah. Is there both mics, and then we'll take one for the Q&A with the audience after? Okay. Yeah. So
So you can all share one mic and you'll have your, you're not gonna, oh, I thought we were gonna do two and then we'll take it, or no, it doesn't matter. We don't have an extra for the. Okay. Oh, thank you.
I'll just do this. We have, organizer stuff to.
I thought I had stuff.
Or is it risk analysis stage?
Yeah, I'm hoping to finish within like a year, but we'll see. Yeah,
That's exciting.
yeah, it is. I thought that once I like cleaned the data and was on analysis, I thought it would be a bit quicker right now, but no, the data team, I thought it would too. Yeah, because they would move just fast and I can support it like second by second.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a lot of fun. And also just going to places. Oh, and the pandemic. Slowing down at the beginning. I started doing other things. Like I was working science outreach programs and not holding my data. Like I can go to Japan again. Yeah. Hard to
It's funny how it's interesting how everyone kind of took a different take on like what to present and stuff. Like I really didn't focus on research at all because I was like, well, I'll make this for like 15-year-olds or something. And other people were more into the research. Yeah, more personal stuff. Yeah. Yeah, but I like that you talked about like the stressors of being a mom and academia and the expectations. We're not going to talk about that, but I feel like that's something pretty interesting. Yeah, no, I just blacked out. Well, there's a recording of it on Zoom or whatever. It's going to be on YouTube, so you can always go back and like analyze yourself. How's your little one?
He's good.
He's
Yeah.
good?
He's good at daycare finally, but it took a while.
Oh, like
He
to find
wouldn't-
a daycare or?
No, he just like wouldn't nap at daycare.
Yeah.
For like a Hello? Hello? All right, so we're gonna move on to the discussion part before the Q&A. So I have a few questions I wrote down. I'd like to start with Julie. So we're gonna share this mic with you guys. You mentioned the ii. Could you just tell us more about the ii? Because they're so fascinating.
Yeah, good question. So ii are a type of lemur, but they're this monotypic type of lemur, which means that, you know, they broke off really early in the evolution of lemurs when lemurs first got to Madagascar. And we're kind of on this independent evolutionary path from all the other lemurs. And there was there's a subfossil ii that was about 3 times as large as the current ii that went extinct about 1,000 years ago. But now there's just, you know, the ii that we have now, Daubentonia madagascariensis is the Latin name, but they are, some people say they look like a rat crossed with a bat who stuck its finger in a light socket. And so they have this, these huge bat-like ears and this kind of matty black fur and really specialized digit on their hands. So this one very, very long middle finger that it looks like this like long skinny chopstick. So they fill the niche of like a woodpecker in Madagascar. So they're percussive hunters. They listen with those huge bat-like ears on tree branches. And then when they find something, they chew through. They actually are the only primate whose teeth never stop growing like a rodent. They chew through into the bark, and then they use that little chopstick like finger and stick it in there to try to get out all the grubs that they can. But the final digit of the finger rotates 360 degrees in its socket like a helicopter. So they, they get right in there and get the grubs. They're just incredible, but they're so weird looking that in Madagascar there is a taboo, or kind of people think that they're like cursed, and that if you see them, like death is imminent or something. So there's actually a lot of kind of persecution of eyes and killing of eyes in Madagascar, sadly, because they're just so incredible. So it was very wild working with them at the Lemur Center, because they're on a reverse light cycle there. So I would work in a dark room where, for them it's night, for me it's day. And there's just incredible variation in how they would navigate my arrays. Like there was a very, very old female who was almost 30 who would just like creep along and like give me dirty looks and, constantly tapping on the wood and like sniffing, tap, 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 sniff, sniff, sniff. And then there was these insane young males that were like climbing like my tripod, climbing the lights, like just crazy variation. Just an amazing species. So,
wow.
Sorry, I could talk about them for an hour.
Yeah. The finger thing to me is just wild. So the next question is for Iulia. So I know for me, after watching Japanese monkeys with their babies, like they're just so independent so early. I kind of like have brought that into my mothering with my son, who's now 14 months. I kind of try to let him do his own thing more, I think, than I would have before I watched primates. I was wondering if for you, have observing primates and working with primates changed or influenced how you mother?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly I think yes, because, I think very specifically the concept of co-sleeping, I think a lot of us would, because every non-human primate sleeps in direct contact with their baby. And so that already, I didn't set out to co-sleep with my son, but it was very quickly felt like, oh yeah, okay, I want to, and that's a bit, I wouldn't say it's taboo, but I think people still have a hard time with the idea that maybe it's not safe or whatever. So I certainly, and he still sleeps in my bed and he's almost 5. I'd like him to move out of my bed at some point. So I'm like trying to figure out ways to kind of trick him into it, but it's been a real, and because breastfeeding was so challenging for me as an intersex person, I still managed to do it for a year, but like it was a constant struggle for me. And co-sleeping saved it because it was all nighttime. I wasn't sleeping basically, but it was just like he was on my nipple all night. So that was like the way that I kept, and it was important to me because I study milk and lactation. And I really, maybe I set my expectations to, like, looking back, I'm like, I really was very stressed out about it, like many mothers are, about breastfeeding, because you're just constantly fed this information of how important it is. But yeah, so I'd say co-sleeping, and then just accepting kids, maybe in some ways accepting them for their variation. Like some kids are just shy and timid, some are all over the place. And in some ways I look at my son and I think, okay, if you were a chimpanzee baby in the wild, you might have already died and just fallen out of a tree because he's such a risk taker. But at the same time, if those infants in the wild survive, like you mentioned with this Johnny guy, right? Yeah. If they survive, they get to be the alpha, because they're just constantly taking risks. They're about, they become the most dominant. So in some ways there are benefits. And so I can kind of look at my kid and kind of to try to appreciate those qualities, even if they are challenges at times. I can kind of be like, okay, this will pay off. Like as an adult, maybe you'll work on the stock market. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. So Laura, next question. So you said you've been at Costa Rica for 10 years and you're researching a forest fragment there. In the 10 years you've been there, has that forest fragment changed, or is it now protected, or like how is that happening?
So the forest fragment where I work, it is privately owned by the family who started the nonprofit that I work for. So it's kind of an unusual situation because it is essentially a family business that's a nonprofit. So it's the Molina family, they're a Nicaraguan family. And they were displaced from Nicaragua in the late 70s with the fall of the dynasty there. They had to go to the States as political exiles, and then they eventually were able to reclaim some of their land in Nicaragua, and they also got money to be able to reclaim land other places like in Costa Rica. So they purchased that land in the 80s. It was a cattle pasture. They reforested it slowly. became interested in conservation and then started a primate field school there long before my time. So they started offering courses, field biology courses of various kinds in the mid-90s. And Dr. Paul Garber, who's a really prominent American primatologist, started the first primate field schools there in around 1995. And he still will lead field courses there occasionally. So the forest itself has, if anything, the fragment itself has become sort of increasingly reforested. So they still do tree planting projects there. Still, my students every summer will plant a tree when they leave as part of what they're doing. And so the forest fragment, sort of any of the spaces that were previously not filled in have been filled in, but it is a 3 square kilometer forest fragment. So outside the boundaries of that fragment, there's no control over what happens because the Molina family doesn't own the land, but within that 3 kilometer square, it's protected.
Okay.
Yeah.
So good to know. That's good to hear that it's actually gaining trees. So Sarah, I was wondering, I know the answer to this already because we chat all the time, but if you could tell us a bit about some of the anecdotal things you've witnessed in terms of behavioral flexibility of some of the disabled individuals, or maybe some of the innovations. I'm thinking maybe of Yuki or Ribbon.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, Ribbon is the one who always comes to mind because she had so many interesting behaviors. I mean, one of the things that all of the monkeys like to do is to kind of, we call it examine water, but they, you know, sit near water and look down and will splash and make bubbles. And Ribbon does that with her feet. So she'll put her feet in the water and then like, and none of the other monkeys much do that with their feet, but she doesn't have hands. And this is how she, you know, sometimes she'll use her elbow also. She also will do a thing, they like to forage for ants and grubs in the leaf litter. And most monkeys will do that with both hands kind of back and forth, sweeping around the litter quickly and then picking out grubs and other tasty things from the leaf litter. And Ribbon would stick her legs out straight and go with her legs and then use her legs like that and then go in with her face and get grubs. So those are, and a lot of like scratching, not with lianas, but on substrate. So like on rocks or wood, or sometimes on the Nobahara's motorbike, but like using something else to scratch their backs. And a lot of the disabled monkeys will do that. And then Nina, your friend, who was in those videos, the little, she's now, she born in 2022?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was watching her last summer, and she uses her feet for all sorts of things. And she, unlike Ribbon and some of the other monkeys, she has kind of mostly functional digits on her feet. So she can use her feet as hands in ways that some of the other monkeys don't. And she's also like crazy fast, like bipedally, just zipping through the forest. Yeah.
Yeah. I saw a video of her on Instagram like a week ago where a juvenile went to lunge at her to play with her, and she was standing on a rail of a stairway and she flipped over and was just hanging on with her feet upside down. Yeah. So this is a question that I ask lots of my friends when at like conferences and stuff. So this one is for Laura and Iulia. What is the craziest thing that has happened to you during field work?
I'll answer first because I have the microphone first. So when I was a PhD student in Madagascar, I got to my field site. It's a very remote field site. I was the only researcher there at the time. So it was myself and a bunch of local people who worked there and a bunch of community members who would kind of come in and out. And it's the field site that I did my PhD at. It's considered to be in Madagascar's Wild West. There's no law enforcement. It's very rural. There's no motorized vehicles. There's no electricity. And so I was told that, so it seemed like there was a community gathering outside my tent one of the first days that I was there. And I asked what was happening. Oh yeah, it's a murder trial. Somebody was murdered in the protected forest where you're going to be working alone for the next 6 months. So I asked more questions about that. And it turned out this person had killed another person. And so he was now being put on trial for that. And the big problem was not that he had killed this other person. It was that he had done so in the protected forest. And that was the problem. He also had not notified the guy's family that he was going to murder him before he did so, which is apparently appropriate etiquette. But the killing was considered to be justified because the man had stolen some of his zebu, which are African cattle and a sign of wealth in Madagascar. So that was a good reason to kill someone. So I was asking some of the people who worked at the reserve, so what will be this man's punishment? For example, could there be a prison that he would be sent to for murdering someone? What usually happens? And they said, oh, we don't really know. Prison, maybe they do that in the cities. Here we make our own rules. So there is a habit of vigilante justice. So I wasn't sure what I was going to see happen here. Maybe he would be killed in some kind of creative way for what he had done to this other man, but it turned out he was fined $20 US. But it was the murder trial happened over the first week that I was there, and so that was a really vivid and graphic sort of initiation to what fieldwork was like, and sort of some of the cultural aspects of coming into a new situation and having to navigate these kinds of cultural differences.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. I'm just
And Julia.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I would just highlight the more wildlife interactions that you would have in a jungle kind of habitat. I mean, there was one field season in 2018 when I would spend maybe 2 hours every night picking off like 80 to 90 ticks off of my body. I've had ticks like in crazy places I won't mention. And it takes a long time to figure out what's going on with that. It's like, is that a mole? What's happening? And then, but I would say, then one of the big things I learned very quickly with chimps is that if they all start running, you don't stop to figure out why. You just start running in the same direction because something is coming, and it's usually huge wasps or bees that are about to attack you. So lots of run-ins with wasps and bees. But the biggest I would say is elephants, because elephants, they migrate huge distances in Africa. And they don't like people because in a lot of the countries that they're walking through, they get shot and hunted. And even in Uganda, there's a lot of illegal poaching of elephants. Like I've come across like massive dead elephants in the forest with their faces hacked off because of the ivory that the poachers are trying to get. And so elephants don't really like people. Elephants are also interesting because while they're so large, they're so quiet in a forest habitat, so you don't get to see them. And so I think one time in particular, I was watching chimps in the trees. It was a group of us, like even two of my students, we were together, or one of my students, actually, the other one was in a different part of the forest. But all of a sudden I heard some rustling behind me, and I kind of thought, oh, that's a chimp charging, because the males come in and sometimes charge around. And I turned around and it was an elephant charging at us. And then realized there were about 8 elephants, and they just started charging all around. And I fell on the ground the entire time, still holding my iPad in my hand. I don't know how, but it was one of those like life flashing before my eyes moments where I thought, oh, so this is how I die. I'm going to get trampled by an elephant. And luckily, I managed to get myself up. And then elephants are very clumsy, it turns out. So I climbed over a big fallen log and looked behind me. The elephant was still coming. He wasn't, the other ones were sort of all around, but and also charging. But this one decided that I would be he would take his anger out on me. But it took him so long to climb over this log that it really gave me a chance to kind of like escape, and it was very, very frightening. And so, yeah, the poor elephants, and actually it is a problem. That's one of the problems in primatology. I would say there's a real macho at some sites. There's a real like macho vibe with the researchers. And so sometimes people, I don't say they're encouraged, but sometimes it's sort of this mentality like, oh, elephants shouldn't stop you. You got to follow the chimps and stick with the chimps. But I think people are coming to terms with the idea that safety is probably a more important thing. And so if there's elephants in an area, just leave. Yeah,
that would be a heck of a way to go, I must say. Yeah. So Sarah, can you think of one of your favorite monkeys and why they are your favorite?
So many favorite monkeys. Meg, maybe my first favorite monkey. She was one of the first monkeys I observed as an undergrad when I was there in '99. And she was really extensively disabled on all 4 limbs, but was not one of the bipedal walkers. She had a lot of, actually, one of the monkeys I've met who had the most trouble moving. She really couldn't, as far as I could tell, run. She could keep up with the group, but she was always last. And she was personality wise, a very funny combination of like rugged and sweet. And she, with her raising her babies. And it turns out that she had been orphaned when she was only 7 months old, which is really quite young for a Japanese macaque to be orphaned, and about as young as you're going to survive. It maybe you might survive at 6 months if you're orphaned, unless you're adopted by a lactating female, because that's about the earliest you could make it. And she was adopted by an adult male who was peripheral to the group, and he carried her with the group wherever they went. And he, I guess, benefited from this in a way because he integrated into the group, and he later became the highest ranking male in the group, and they remained friends throughout their life. And she always ate next to him, and he apparently never mated with her, was never her partner, but they were just friends, and like were in the group their whole life. So yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's very sweet. Julie, can you discuss how collaboration, both within the science community and with local communities, has played a role in your fieldwork and research?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's collaboration is incredibly important. There's so many questions. I think we all, big, broad questions we have as scientists. And the best way to answer those questions very often, are pathways that are already, started, explored by other people. And rather than you starting yourself and spending years, and in the case of primates, right, like years habituating animals and trying to get them to the point where you could actually follow them and watch and answer those big questions. If you just, collaborate really widely with people, and most people are, really open to you approaching them and saying, I was thinking about this. What do you think about that? How about we go and investigate that? So it just like speeds up, I think, the rate with which you can answer all of these big evolutionary questions. And it's been incredibly important in my career to be able to, access different areas, even there's times when you're lacking funding and your collaborators save you through them having funding, and you kind of support each other through this, which leads to these kind of really long-term collaborations where you kind of have each other's back throughout your scientific career. So that's been incredibly important for me with researchers working at other institutions, and my own institution too, actually. And then within the countries I've worked in, so Ghana and Uganda, without the support of like people working there, and none of it would have actually been possible. So I feel like us being social primates, it's kind of the only way that research can get done, right? If you try to be a lone wolf, good for you, but it's going to take you a really long time, and
Totally.
It's going to be a lot harder. So yeah, incredibly important.
Yeah, no, totally. I know, like when the pandemic first started, and all of a sudden I went from being in the lab all the time to like alone in my house, that really changed like the being able to bounce ideas off people and stuff. And yeah, Zoom just doesn't have the same kind of conversation. All right, I'm trying to make it so the mic's easier. So I'll ask Laura a question next. What do you think some of the challenges of primatology are, specifically in the context of coming from Canada?
So I think one big challenge with being a Canadian primatologist is that we do not have wild free-ranging primates in forests in Canada. We might have them in captive situations or in zoos, and we can study them there, but we have to travel to where the primates are in order to do our research. And we have to travel to countries where we might not speak the language, where there might be local people who already study the primates. And so fostering those kinds of relationships are really important. Also, having the funds to be able to travel there regularly is a huge thing. So being able to access research sites, having the means to do so. And I'm really fortunate that through my job with Maderas Rainforest Conservancy, I'm able to go to the field several times a year and spend usually a month or two in the summer and a few weeks in the winter, sort of consistently being able to access the same site, which is something that's huge. And I think with things like, a lot of us have touched on COVID-19 and the global pandemic and how that's affected things. And I think not being able to go to the field for almost 2 years in my case, really impacted research in terms of which monkeys were habituated at my field site, for example, and which weren't. I think I touched on the capuchins losing habituation and the spider monkeys all of a sudden being really easy to study after the pandemic. But I also couldn't collect data for a few years, so ended up using that time to just write papers with the data that I already had, which turned out well because I turned out to have enough data on howler monkeys to be able to work on a lot of projects. But if you are a Canadian primatologist, you need to be prepared for things like that, because during things like a global pandemic, you can't necessarily do the work that you want when you want, or there could be things like political instability in the countries where you study wild primates. Like there was political unrest in Madagascar, for example, during my doctorate. So I had to delay my field research until things stabilized enough to be able to travel and do research in that country. So you face challenges like that by not being able to work in Canada and by having to go somewhere international to do your work.
Yeah, well, totally. We all like travel, yeah. I want to open up to the audience, so I'm just going to ask one more question. So if anyone here is like wanting to become a primatologist or aspiring or just like curious about what's the next step, do you guys, I'm going to open it up to all of you. Do you have any suggestions for maybe resources or advice, or maybe how to go about that? I know that's a huge question, but if anything just like pops in your head before we open it up. Yeah.
So I think my main advice for people that think they want to be a primatologist is to see if you can do a field school. I know they're not cheap and sometimes a little bit difficult to access, but I taught that field school in Ghana for a few years, and I would always bring 9 budding primatologists so happy, you know, to be studying primates. And then they'd realize, yeah, it's very boring and it's very hard and it's very stressful. And so I would come back with maybe one of which was Iulia one year. So I think a field school really clarifies in your mind whether you actually want to do that or not.
Yeah, no, totally good advice.
And I'll just say that I teach a field school in Costa Rica, as I mentioned. So if any of you are interested, I am still enrolling for this summer. You can come talk to me after, or you can email me. I usually teach it twice a year, summer and winter.
I'd also say that it takes a lot of compromise, I think, to be a primatologist, mainly because we do have to do such long fields. Not all primatologists, but a lot of us do really long field seasons. And I mean, some of you guys have been lucky to, you know, have partners that are really supportive, where they'll wait for you or they'll come with you to your field work to do field work. But the other side of it is that, you know, you leave for a year and life moves on. Like people don't want to, you know, especially when it's maybe the other way around, when it's a man who goes to the field and women are, you know, maybe more likely to wait. But if you're in a heterosexual relationship, heteronormative relationship, it's unlikely, or it's harder to find a guy who will just like wait around for a year while you don't have internet access and can't talk to them. And so I think there are a lot of, and then also with family members, if you do end up being lucky enough to get a job, it's unlikely that it'll be a job near your family or where people live. And so, you know, which is fine, but there's a lot of compromises when it comes to friendships, family life, and you kind of just end up putting your job first a lot. For a long part of your career, it seems like. And that's why sometimes it ends up being frustrating even when you have kids, for instance, they kind of keep expecting you to do that. And it's like, well, I've just spent the last 2 decades putting my job first. Like I'd like to be a good parent or whatever. So yeah.
Yep. No, that's good answer. Great answer. Does anyone from the audience have a question?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. That was very inspiring and empowering. I'm a PhD candidate working with Sarah and Brogan. So one thing that everybody mentioned is everybody has a field site, right? But a lot of professors have their own field site. Some of you do. So what I'm wondering is, how do you go about finding and creating a field site? Like, what is that process? How do you do it? Like, how do you make that work legally, logistically? What's the process of that?
I mean, I've helped start 2 field sites, and I think literally you just travel around until you find areas where you know there's primates, obviously, and they're accessible. And then if that's possible, then you start to make links with the community. You start to make relationships in the community and see if it's possible for you to, you know, to spend time there long term. Is there any sort of, you know, infrastructure accommodations where you can stay, where you can have students stay? And then I really do think it's just about a long-term investment in, you know, the local people. And then you have to habituate the primates. And if they're hunted, forget it. Don't even try. I'm serious. Don't. They'll die. And if you habituate them, you are putting them at risk. So you have to be in an area where people don't hunt primates to eat them. So a Muslim area, basically. Or traditionally areas where the primates are traditionally protected. So
I'll just add, like, I think a number of us work in private places. I mean, Laura, you were talking about that, and at Awajishima Monkey Center is a privately run tourist business. So it was, I mean, a lot of luck and kind of ending up there and making relationships with the people who were there, and, you know, having an invitation to go back, which is lovely. And the other thing is through collaboration, because my other field work is in Brazil and in collaboration with a Brazilian primatologist, Renata Ferreira. And so she was here visiting and contacted me, and I was looking for a collaboration and she was looking for a collaborator, and, you know, it was a good fit. And so we have kind of this long-term collaboration where she has field sites where she works, and now my students can also go there and work. And so it's a really nice, a nice back and forth collaborative arrangement that happened that, you know, gives me as a Western primatologist access to places to work in Brazil that I wouldn't otherwise be able to work at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll highlight also, yeah, collaborations is how you kind of make get to go to certain field sites. I will say, though, there are problems with gatekeeping, especially amongst, you know, certain types of primates. People are very protective of people being there. There's a lot of vetoing of projects. So the political side of working at specific sites can be really challenging. The other thing that I do want to say, and just based on what Julie was saying too, like ethically, you know, I personally struggle as a primatologist to figure out, there's this idea of like habituating primates, and even if they're not being hunted, like they get, you know, being around people, being comfortable around people ends up increasing various other issues with the spreading of diseases. And, you know, we had lots of chimpanzees die certain years from like the common cold that they get from humans, which for them is fatal in many cases. And then also just this concept of, and I know a mutual student of ours, my student Florence Landry, who's really interested in this concept of helicopter science that's becoming more and more, I think, common to talk about, which is this idea that, and it comes through this like tradition of anthropology where it's like the white man or the white woman that goes to this like, you know, remote place in Africa. And it's sort of this idea of like helicopter science, that us as scientists, we go into this field site, we just collect our data. And then a lot of the times, or I feel like a lot of the times, I'm not actually engaging in any meaningful way with the local people. And I wish I want to work on that more. And sort of the idea that like we're not just like these white people that are coming in and just like using all their resources, taking all the monkey poo and then leaving and doing our work and not really contributing anything to the local people. Is problematic. And I mean, like I said, that comes through this tradition of anthropology that's already a little bit like, you know, underlying racist tendencies that we really need to keep fighting against, and sort of being cognizant of it and trying to improve things. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And even at conferences, they talk about how important it is to learn the local language before going. Yeah. Are there any other questions? There's one right
Hi, thank you so much for that. It was amazing. I teared up multiple times looking at the monkeys, and I really didn't think that I would feel like that. I'm a conservation scientist, and I am in the same program with Brogan, and I work with Indigenous folks, and I was thinking whether, thank you so much for touching upon how anthropology is an extremely extractivist, racist sort of discipline that was, developed by Western institutions of knowledge, and it, for some very strange reason, it stays loyal to those roots that are very racist and very paternalist. No, what's the name? Patriarchal. Yeah, and colonial, of course. I was wondering if, especially those of you who mentioned coming in contact with colonies of monkeys that were not very well known to Western scientists, whether you had an opportunity to find their local names, because there was a lot of scientific names used, and I was wondering if you collect their local names, what those local names are rooted in, like is it rooted in their behaviors or where they live, and whether there was an opportunity for you to look at the relationship between the community and these monkeys and how they sustain each other, and whether there were any territorial ties or that sort of thing. Thank you so much.
Wow, great question. Does anyone want to?
I think Boabing Fima is a really good example of this. So I talked about a great amount of bushmeat hunting going on in Central West Africa, but Boabing Fima was this sort of like oasis with just like these hundreds of monkeys, dripping out of the trees, 2 different species. And the reason that they're there and that people have not hunted them traditionally is that they're thought to be children of the gods, so children of the local gods. So there's a god Abojuo for the black and white colobus and Doworo for the Mona monkeys. And there's actually a local shrine in the forest where there's each, so Boabing and Fima each have a fetish priest who's responsible for like the shrine. So one to the for Abojuo, one for Doworo, and they have like yearly festivals, like at the yam festival when people harvest yams, they bring traditional offerings down to the shrine, and they pour libations and thank the gods for like the successful harvest for that year. And so people even actually settled in that area. It was people from the north that came down to that area and drank at that stream, which is in the now sacred grove, and saw the monkeys and had a vision that, this was a place they should settle because the monkeys, would keep them safe and would bring good fortune. And in fact, now Boabing Fima is the #1 tourist site in Ghana. Like it brings very good fortune to the local people and the local management committee. So it's worked out very well for them actually. But yeah, and in Uganda as well, the monkeys, the local name is Nkima, and the people are very tolerant of the colobus monkeys because they don't crop raid much. They do eat cassava leaves, but people eat the cassava root. So, but the relationship with the vervet monkeys is very bad. The vervet monkeys crop raid, the vervet monkeys house raid, and people have poisoned our vervets on multiple occasions, and we've lost like a third of our group of vervets several times. But they kind of like coyotes, at low population density, they start to produce infants much more quickly, and so they've always rebounded. But we have these kind of weird groups that are like run by juveniles. And, honestly, it's like little Lord of the Flies going on there. and like dominance hierarchies are like breaking down relative to what we see in like a normal vervet group. So, which I think is actually, a big impact of anthropogenics that we need to look at. And so, yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah. Did anyone else want to touch on that question before moving on? No. I think there's a question on Zoom. Yeah.
There is a question on Zoom, and it is for Laura. Okay, so Virginie asks and says, I am curious to hear more about the increased level of habituation observed in spider monkeys after COVID. What is the explanation for this?
So that is a good question, and one that I'm still trying to figure out. But one thing that I've noticed is that the level of habituation seems to be different in different areas of the forest. So close to sort of the more human impacted areas, particularly where there's a cleared area where there's student housing and researcher housing essentially, and that borders the forest. So if you encounter any spider monkeys there, they tend to be really, really habituated. But if you go deep into the forest and encounter the same spider monkeys, they will respond very differently. So we're not sure if it's individual monkeys that are changing their behavior when they're in different forest areas, or if it's that some spider monkeys are simply more habituated than others and others are showing more aggressive behaviors. We don't have a good way of telling individual identity or determining individual identity in the population. So that's something that we're still thinking about, but we have noticed a huge difference in terms of how approachable they are and how tolerant they are of humans. And it could be that during the COVID-19 pandemic, because there were fewer people around the human populated areas of the research site, there weren't any classes coming, for example, with students, then the monkeys sort of decided that coming closer to camp was a good idea. And there was a lot of food available for them there. And they simply kept it up. And they realized that the humans who were sort of at this camp area were no threat to them. So continued to sort of show that behavior when they were close to camp. But when they were deeper into the forest, maybe weren't expecting to see humans there because humans are there much more rarely. And so are still a little more cautious when they do that. So it is a really interesting question, one that we're still trying to understand more fully.
I love spider monkeys. They're so lanky.
Yeah. And they're really smart. So that could be part of it. Like their cognition is so advanced that it's interesting to know how they perceive the landscape and what their perceptions of humans being there might mean.
I think we'll do just maybe one more question, or does anyone else have one? Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I was just wondering, like, is there a way that you filter or interpret or even discard the data you collect based on the fact that you are present and affecting the animals, like especially, I guess, like primarily in like wild field work? Like, is there a way that you sort through the data you collect, knowing that you might be infecting these animals, habituating them, that sort of?
Oh, that's a great question. So as we've been habituating various species, we basically don't even use the data from like the first like many months until we feel that literally like they're treating us like a tree and we're not impacting their behavior. But we try to always like still stay a very respectful distance away from them, and we don't walk I have to kind of train people in the field that you walk quietly, but you make sure they know that you're there, that you don't surprise them. I actually do this, Diane Fossey used to say that she would kind of grunt in the field. And that's what I literally walk around, I go, or I go, hi monkeys, hi monkeys, hi monkeys, just so they know that I'm there and I'm walking, and because then you surprise them too, that of course also changes their behavior. So you move quietly and respectfully and stay away, but you also make sure they know that you're there. Because if you surprise them, if you surprise them near an infant, they could even react with aggression, right? So you clear your throat a lot and go, hi monkey, hi monkey.
Did anyone else want to
just add? This is for mostly Japanese macaques, and they're very used to people at a Wajishima Monkey Center because it's this, one of these monkey centers where tourists come. But we do have protocols where, and there have been, one in particular, one adult female over the years who did not want to be focal followed. No. And so we didn't. That we would randomly select another monkey. And if that, but even for ones who were less vehement about it, there were females who were less into being focal followed. And some days if they were glancing at us, if they were open mouth threatening, you would stop following them and maybe try another day. But yeah, there's sometimes where we would change focal animals because they didn't want us to be following them and it appeared to be stressing them out.
And then in terms of passing on diseases, we try to, or in the past several years, I think a few years before even COVID, at like the chimpanzee sites, everyone started wearing masks, using hand sanitizer all the time, trying not to touch any of the leaves. So really trying to decrease this spread of disease to them. I'd also say in terms of like the kind of data collection that a lot of us do with behavioral data collection, there are ways to sort of sort through, like there are codes for, okay, the monkey keeps looking at the observer. So there are ways to identify if a monkey is looking at you too much. Also with chimpanzees, there are some anecdotal reports that chimpanzees, because chimpanzees like to do boundary patrols to check for neighbors because they don't, they want to protect their territory. And there are some anecdotal reports that potentially when humans are around, chimpanzees are more likely to do these boundary patrols, potentially because they possibly know that the other groups are not habituated and that the other groups would find humans scary. And so they're almost, there's this idea that chimpanzees will use humans to their advantage and these boundary patrols as sort of like, we brought in the big guns or whatever as the human. But that does affect their behavior. So it is important to kind of always keep in mind that when humans are around, but that does potentially change the way that they behave in some ways.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, so we went over time. As you can see, I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. If you still have questions, we have lunch set up. So we're going to stick around. I think the panelists are all staying around too, so you'll be able to ask your questions there. If you're online and you had questions or you wanted to get a hold of any of the panelists, you could just Google their names and I'm sure email them and that would be fine. This is going to be on YouTube, so if you forget their names, you can look back there. I just wanted to thank Fourth Space really quickly because it's such an amazing space. Yeah. And the Public Scholar Program again for having this event. So, yeah.
All right. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Brogan. Thank you for the people in the space and on Zoom for your questions. It was such a great conversation. So just, reminder that this is already available on our YouTube channel if you want to share or revisit it. And we hope you have a delightful lunch and a good Monday. Thank you.